Living in the shadows. My name is Abigail Hawkins, but everyone but the IRS knows me as Abby. Sometimes I think I should have been born invisible. It would have saved years of trying to be noticed by my own family. Invisibility comes in many ways. Sometimes it's a lack of attention. Sometimes it's quiet disappointment in your face. But most often, it's when your accomplishments are measured not by your own standards, but by someone else's. In my case, my brother Jason's. For years, I watched my parents collect his successes with such reverence, as if they were collecting rare works of art, while my ideas and projects were nothing more than pleasant souvenirs that were politely noticed and then put away in a faraway drawer. But secrets have a special power, and my secret grew in the shadow of his glory, like a plant that, deprived of direct sunlight, finds its own way to the sky, slowly, stubbornly, and inevitably. What they didn't know then, and I barely dared admit to myself, my path in technology wasn't a failure. It was just different. And one day, that difference would change everything. You know what the hardest thing about living in someone else's shadow? It's not the hurtful comparisons or neglect. It's the gradual acceptance of one's invisibility as the norm. Have you ever noticed how children growing up near bright sunshine begin to believe that their own light isn't important enough? Every family gathering in our house, whether it was Sunday lunch or holiday dinner, turned into a one-actor show. Jason, tell everyone about your new project at Digital Edge, my mom would usually begin, and my brother, as if on cue, would straighten up and begin his monologue about microservices or code optimization or whatever new framework he was implementing. We've completely rewritten the backend using asynchronous calls, which has reduced load times by 60%, he'd tell me, while everyone listened intently, nodding, even though half the family had no idea what he was talking about. And I sat quietly, picking at the plate of ravioli my mom always made for these meetings. Every once in a while, someone would politely ask, "How's your job, Abby?" And when I started talking about how we'd rethought the user interface for the app to make it more intuitive for older users, the eyes of my listeners would gradually glaze over. And Jason would usually end my explanations with his crowning achievement. The problem with you, Abby, is that you have these big, vague ideas without understanding the technical limitations. It may be hard for you to visualize how such a family dynamic forms, but in our case, it started long before I was born. My parents, Rachel and David Hawkins, met in the 90s while working at one of Seattle's first tech startups. My mom was a back-end developer. My dad specialized in network security. Their first date consisted of a 6-hour code debugging marathon, romance in its purest form, if you ask them. They got married a year later, and our house became a sort of mini incubator for tech talent. Programming was not just a profession for us, it was a way of life. Dinners were spent discussing new programming languages. Sunday walks were interrupted by arguments about the advantages of different operating systems. And instead of bedtime stories, I sometimes listened to my dad explain the basic principles of algorithms to Jason. Jason, 3 years older, had shown an interest in computers before he could read. At 5, he could build a simple computer from parts his dad brought home from work. At 8, he wrote his first program. At 11, he won the school programming contest, beating out high school students. Can you imagine what happened in our house after each of those accomplishments? Celebrations, praise, calls to all the relatives. Mom cried with pride. Dad clapped him on the shoulder, with the look of a man whose genetic experiment had exceeded all expectations. "Our little genius," they'd say, and Jason would glow, soaking up the praise like a sponge. The spare bedroom was converted into his personal lab, complete with computers, servers, and all the equipment a young tech genius could dream of. And then I was born. An ordinary child who showed no remarkable aptitude for programming at the age of 3. I loved computers, but more as a tool than as an object of worship. I was interested in what I could do with them, not how they were organized inside. In middle school, when Jason was already winning regional hackathons, I became interested in how people interacted with technology. I remember my first serious project, a survey of our school's teachers about the problems they were having with educational software. In the evening, full of enthusiasm, I spread the results out on the kitchen table. Look, I found that most teachers spend more time wrestling with the interface than preparing for class. If we recycled— Very nice, dear. Mom interrupted me with a quick glance at my graphs. Oh, by the way, Jason just got an internship at Tech Future. Can you believe it? They only take college students, and he's still in high school. And the conversation turned back to his accomplishments. My worksheets with graphs and suggestions for improvement were left lying on the table until I put them away myself before dinner. You may think I'm exaggerating, or that this is just a childish resentment that should have faded with time. But imagine that your every accomplishment, your every idea, is constantly being rated on a scale where the maximum mark is what someone else has already accomplished. How would you feel? When I entered college, choosing to major in user experience and interface design, the reaction was predictable. UX design? My father interjected with bewilderment. But that's not a real technical specialty, is it? Are you sure you don't want to study computer science like Jason? Interface design is for people who can't code, Jason added with a grin. By then, he was already a rising star at Digital Edge, an enterprise software company. At 23, he had become the youngest technical department head in the company's history. His picture even made the cover of a local technology magazine under the headline, "The Future of Programming." That cover still hangs framed in my parents' house, next to his diplomas and awards. My thesis, which received the highest grade and special praise from the dean, sits modestly on a bookshelf in the living room, between cookbooks and old issues of National Geographic. In this endless competition that I never asked to participate in, there was only one person who saw me, really saw me. My grandmother Eleanor, my mother's mother, a former librarian with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. She lived in a small house in a Seattle suburb, surrounded by a garden of roses she'd grown for decades. Every second Saturday of the month, I visited her. We drank tea from the fine china cups she saved for special occasions and talked about everything in the world. Unlike the rest of the family, Grandma never started with a question about Jason. "Tell me about your ideas, Abby," she said, settling into her favorite chair. "What new things have you seen in the world?" And I did. About watching elderly people trying to use ATMs, about a project for an app that would help Alzheimer's patients navigate everyday tasks, about the concept of an educational platform that would adapt to each child's way of learning. Grandma listened with that special attention that makes you feel like every word you say matters, and then spoke a phrase that became my personal beacon during my years of doubt. Different minds solve different problems. Never let anyone tell you that your way of seeing has no value. Grandma Eleanor understood what my parents didn't. Technical genius is just one form of intelligence. She saw value in my approach, in my ability to think about the people using technology, not just the technology itself. "The world is full of brilliant programmers, Abby," she once told me, "but there aren't many who understand how to make technology really useful to ordinary people." Maybe it was those conversations with my grandmother that laid the first seeds of my secret, an idea that began to form while I was still in college, but that I kept to myself. The idea that the gap between technical excellence and user experience was not just an interesting problem, but a real opportunity. I graduated college and took a job as a product manager at a mid-sized technology company. Nothing fancy, nothing to rival the impressive career of Jason, who by then had become VP of Development at Digital Edge. At family dinners, I was still a secondary character, listening politely about his technical exploits. "Digital Edge is about to release a new database management system that will change the industry," he bragged while Mom served dessert. "I'm personally leading the redesign of the entire architecture." "How wonderful, dear," Mom glowed. "And you, Abby, are you still with the same company?" I nodded and smiled, keeping my secret. Because what they didn't know was slowly turning into something much bigger than they could have imagined. Like a plant that, deprived of direct sunlight, finds its own way to the sky. Slowly, stubbornly, and inevitably, my path in technology wasn't a failure. It was just different. And one day, that difference will change everything. A secret startup, do you know how sometimes a chance meeting can change your whole life? One conversation, one idea thrown at the right moment, when your mind is ready to accept it. And suddenly, the familiar world begins to expand, opening up new horizons. For me, that moment came 3 years after graduating from college, at a technology conference in downtown Seattle. By then, I was already working as a product manager at Tech Solutions, a company that wasn't the most well-known, but quite respectable. My job was to coordinate software development for the banking industry. Nothing revolutionary, but a stable salary, a decent line on my CV, and the opportunity to observe from the inside how the industry works. The conference focused on innovation in enterprise software. At first glance, not the most exciting topic, if you're not as passionate about technology as I am. After another presentation full of technical jargon and graphs showing productivity gains of some fraction of a percent, I escaped to the hotel bar. I needed to clear my head and think about what I had just heard. Or, more accurately, what I hadn't heard. At the bar, I spotted a woman about my age sitting at a corner table, padded with notepads and looking thoughtful as she drew something on a napkin. She looked like she was solving a complex equation in her head. Something about her focused expression caught my eye, and I decided to approach. "Are you hiding from another presentation on microservices?" I asked, and she looked up, smiling. "Rather, I'm trying to understand why all these brilliant developers are creating products that are impossible to use without a computer science degree," she said. That's how I met Lauren Chen, a talented developer from San Francisco who had come to the conference, hoping to find solutions to the same problems I'd been pondering for years. That evening, we talked until almost dawn. Lauren, armed with a pen and a stack of cocktail napkins, drew charts and diagrams to illustrate her point. "The problem is that most enterprise software is developed by programmers for programmers," she said, vigorously shading another diagram. "But the end users aren't developers. They're ordinary people who need intuitive interfaces. Have you ever had that special feeling when someone articulates a thought that's been in your head for years, but that you couldn't quite put into words? It's like meeting an old friend you didn't even know existed." "Exactly!" I exclaimed, feeling the fire of enthusiasm inside me. And it's not just the interface. These systems are not interconnected. Finance uses one software, HR uses another, marketing uses a third, and all of them can't exchange data properly. Lauren raised her glass. "Here's to people who realize that technology should serve the users, not the other way around." That late-night conversation quickly turned into an obsessive side project. We started calling every night after work, exchanging ideas via email, and meeting on weekends in a virtual space. Lauren took over the technical side. I took over the user needs research and business model. We began conceptualizing an integrated enterprise software solution that was both powerful and intuitive. A solution that would unify the different departments of the company while requiring no special training to use. We called it Nexus, Connection Point, Communication Center. Existing solutions are like Swiss knives, where each tool works fine on its own, but together, they create an awkward, cumbersome mechanism, I explained to Lauren during one of our virtual brainstorming sessions. "We're not just creating a set of tools, we're creating an ecosystem." After 3 months of conceptualizing and prototyping, we decided it was time to look for funding. Lauren had connections in the San Francisco venture capital community through her previous work, and we prepared a presentation for several potential investors. The first 2 meetings ended in polite rejections. Interesting concept, but too ambitious. The market is already saturated with similar solutions, standard phrases that investors usually use to reject projects they don't believe in. But at the third meeting, a miracle happened. A representative of Innovatech, a venture fund specializing in enterprise software, listened carefully to our presentation, asked some deep technical questions, which Lauren answered brilliantly, and then turned to me. And how do you plan to deploy this solution to companies that have been using existing systems for years? This was my moment. I explained in detail our phased implementation strategy that allowed companies to seamlessly transition to our platform without disruptive changes to their workflows. When I finished, he nodded and uttered the phrase that changed everything. I think we can offer you seed funding of $500,000. Can you imagine how I felt at that moment? It was a mixture of euphoria, fear, and disbelief. $500,000, the amount that was turning our dream from an abstract idea into a real business. After signing all the documents and receiving the first tranche of funding, Lauren and I were faced with a serious choice: keep our stable jobs or risk everything for our startup. For Lauren, the decision was obvious. She had always dreamed of having her own business and had already participated in several startups. For me, however, it was a step into the unknown, full of not only financial, but also personal risks. The evening before I made my final decision, I sat on the balcony of my apartment for a long time, looking out at the lights of Seattle. What if Jason was right, and 90% of startups really do go bankrupt in the first year? What if all my ideas turn out to be just another vague concept without an understanding of technical limitations? What if I'm just not cut out to lead a technology company? But then I remembered Grandma Eleanor's words: different minds solve different problems. Maybe my vision and my approach is exactly what the market needs right now. Maybe my years of living in Jason's shadow had given me a unique perspective that was my greatest asset. The next day, I tendered my resignation. It was a decision that transformed me from an observer to an active participant in my own life. Now I had to tell my family. Here I was, faced with a dilemma. Should I tell them the scope of the project or keep it a secret until I had something to brag about? I knew Jason would dismiss my idea as naive or technically unsound, and my parents, even with the best of intentions, would inadvertently dampen my enthusiasm with their doubts and worries. In the end, I decided to compromise, to disclose the fact of the startup, but not to go into details about the funding and scope of our plans. Let it be my secret, my trump card that I would reveal when the time came. At another family dinner, when Jason finished talking about his new project at Digital Edge, I carelessly mentioned, "By the way, I quit my job. My coworker Lauren and I decided to start our own startup." The reaction was exactly what I expected. My mom froze with her fork in the air, my dad frowned, and Jason snorted. "Another tech startup," he said, shaking his head. "Do you know what the probability of failure is? Like 90% go broke in the first year. But hey, good luck with that." "Honey, are you sure this is a wise decision?" Mom asked, looking at me worriedly. "Your job has been so stable." "What exactly will your startup do?" Dad asked, clearly trying to assess the technical prospects of the idea. I gave the most general description, avoiding mentioning venture capital funding and ambitious plans. As I expected, their reaction was a mixture of polite interest and poorly concealed skepticism. Jason even offered to look up the code when you have something worthwhile, as if doing me a favor. After dinner, just as I was about to leave, my father took me aside. "Abby, I realize you want to prove something, but startups are a risky business. If you need financial help to get you through until you find a new job." "Thanks, Dad, but I've got it under control," I replied, feeling a strange mixture of irritation and gratitude for his concern. The next day, I went to Grandma Eleanor's house. If there was one person in our family with whom I could share the truth, it was her. We sat in her garden, among the blooming roses, and I told her everything about meeting Lauren, about our concept, about the venture capital funding, and about how I'd hidden the scope of the project from the rest of the family. "I knew you'd find your way," Grandma said, her eyes glistening with pride. "Your approach to technology has always been special, even if others didn't see it." And then she uttered a phrase that was another turning point for me. "I want to invest in your startup, Abby. $25,000. I was stunned. Grandma had always lived modestly, and even though I knew she had savings, such an amount seemed huge. Grandma, it's very risky, I objected. Most startups do fail, and I can't guarantee. I'm not doing this out of charity, she interrupted me with the determination that was always hidden behind her mild mannerisms. I'm doing this because I believe in you, and I see you as a good investment. Let them see the results when the time comes. In that moment, I realized that I had received something much more valuable than money. I received confirmation of my value, my vision from the person whose opinion meant the most to me. The following week, Lauren and I officially incorporated Nexus Solutions and rented a small office in Seattle's tech district. A new chapter of my life had begun, a chapter in which I was no longer just the little sister of a tech genius, but the founder of a startup with an ambitious mission to change the way people interacted with technology. I didn't know then where this path would lead or what challenges lay ahead. But one thing I knew for sure: my secret, my non-technical perspective, which had been underestimated for so long, could be exactly what the market needed. And one day, who knows, maybe even Jason will have to recognize the value of my approach. If my story resonates with your soul, if you've ever felt undervalued or lived in someone else's shadow, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. There are many more stories ahead about finding your own way in a world that tries to push you into someone else's frame of reference. And remember, your vision has value, even if others don't see it yet. 3 years can change everything. Have you ever looked back and not recognized your own life? Sometimes I think the past me, that insecure product manager dreaming of her own startup, now looks back at me with wonder and disbelief. In those 3 years, Nexus Solutions has grown from 2 founders in a tiny office to a company with 117 employees, occupying 3 floors in a modern Seattle business center. We raised $60 million in venture capital funding at a company valuation of $200 million. We were written about in the tech press and invited to speak at conferences. Our integrated enterprise software platform won several prestigious industry awards. All this time, my family knew I had a startup, but I deliberately downplayed its size and success. Not out of petty revenge, but out of a reluctance to be put under the microscope of their expectations and comparisons again. I wanted Nexus to evolve at its own pace, without the constant questions about when we would reach digital edge levels. Ironically, while Nexus was growing, Digital Edge was beginning to experience serious difficulties. Their code base, once revolutionary, was becoming increasingly outdated. Customers complained about the difficulty of integrating with new systems. More agile competitors, including us, were entering the market. The day our board of directors met to discuss strategies for continued growth, I had no idea I was on the cusp of a moment that would change not only my professional life, but the entire family dynamic. "Organic growth is good," said Marcus, our CFO, leafing through the presentation. "But if we want to accelerate, we should look at strategic acquisitions." Lauren, who now held the position of CTO, nodded. "There are several companies with a strong technical base, but an outdated approach to user experience. We could integrate their technology and greatly expand our offering." "I have a list of potential acquisition targets," Marcus continued, handing out folders of documents. I opened my copy and froze. Third on the list was Digital Edge. "That's—" I hesitated, not knowing how to explain the situation. "It's your brother's company, I know," Marcus said calmly. "It creates a certain conflict of interest, but from a purely business point of view, the acquisition makes sense. They have a strong technical foundation, a loyal customer base, and a reputation in the market. The fact that they are in a tight spot right now makes them an attractive acquisition target." In that moment, I experienced a strange mix of emotions. Part of me savored the poetic justice of the situation. To think, a non-technical sister company buying the company of a brilliant programmer brother. But the other part worried about the personal complications this would create. How would Jason react? How would it affect our family relationship? "We need to evaluate the pros and cons," I said, trying to sound professional and detached. "Let's not make any rash decisions." I spent the next 2 weeks in a constant state of tension. During the day, I participated in endless discussions about acquisition strategy, studied financial reports, and listened to presentations by lawyers and consultants. At night, I lay awake, imagining every possible scenario. What if Jason refused to work under me? What if he took the acquisition as a personal insult? What if it completely ruined our relationship? You're probably thinking I should have just talked to him. But years of living in the shadows had created an invisible wall between us. We socialized at family reunions, exchanged formal holiday greetings, but never shared our innermost thoughts or concerns. In addition, my professional ethics did not allow me to discuss a potential acquisition before a formal board decision. After weeks of analysis and discussion, the decision was made. The Nexus Solutions Board of Directors approved an acquisition strategy that included Digital Edge among the 5 companies to be acquired. The official announcement was to be released on Monday, the day after the traditional Easter dinner at Grandma Eleanor's house. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or maybe fate has a special sense of drama. On the way to Grandma's house, I rehearsed possible scenarios for a conversation with Jason. Should I find a moment and quietly tell him in private, before the official announcement? Or wait until the press release was published and then call? Neither option seemed ideal. Grandma's house greeted me with the smell of fresh baked goods and the sound of piano music. Grandma always turned on the classics during holiday dinners. When I walked in, the family was already gathered. My parents were helping to set the table. Jason was sitting in Grandma's favorite chair, talking excitedly. "There's our businesswoman," Dad exclaimed when he saw me. "How's your little startup doing?" Small startup is a phrase that has haunted me for 3 years, as if what I had created could never compare to Jason's great technological achievements. "I'm fine, thanks," I replied neutrally, kissing my mom on the cheek. "What can I do for you?" Grandma Eleanor watched me from the couch, her eyes shining with that special glint that came when she knew something that others didn't. Of course, she was the only one I regularly told about the real extent of the Nexus, but I hadn't told her about the plans to acquire Digital Edge. That was confidential information I couldn't reveal, even to her. Easter dinner went on as usual. We exchanged news, discussed recent family events, and recalled funny stories from the past. And, as always, Jason dominated the conversation. At Digital Edge, we're going through a complete reorganization of our architecture, he announced as he poured himself a second baked potato. We're switching to a microservice architecture, optimizing processes, and implementing a new quality control system. I ate in silence, knowing that this complete reorganization was a desperate attempt to save a sinking ship. Digital Edge's latest financial reports, which I'd studied last week, showed a steady decline in revenue and an exodus of customers. "That sounds impressive," Dad said proudly. "You've always been on the cutting edge of technology." Jason smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. "Sure, it's hard work, but someone has to do it. Technical solutions don't just appear on their own." I felt a familiar prick of irritation. Typical Jason, presenting himself as the hero, saving the company through his technical brilliance, when in fact their problems were caused precisely because they'd been focusing on the technical side for too long, ignoring the needs of the users. "And how are you doing, Abby?" Mom asked, politely trying to include me in the conversation. "Is your company still exists?" Exists. As if the most amazing thing about my startup was that it hadn't gone bankrupt yet. "Yes, Mom, it still exists," I replied, trying not to show how hurt I was by her wording. "Abby," Grandma Eleanor said suddenly, her voice clear despite its softness, "hasn't your company been doing very well lately?" All eyes turned to me. I felt the blood rush to my face. What did grandmother know? Had she somehow found out about the acquisition plans? "Yes, Grandma, things are going well with us," I answered cautiously. "Good?" Grandma grinned. "More than well, I'd say. Didn't your valuation pass $200 million after the last round of funding?" Silence hung in the room. I saw Jason's eyes widen in surprise, my dad freeze with his fork halfway to his mouth, and my mom's eyes shift from me to Grandma and back again in disbelief. 200 million? Jason finally squeezed out. There must be some mistake. Abby can't. There's no mistake, Grandma confirmed, sipping calmly from her glass. My original investment of $25,000 is now worth 10 times that amount. That's a great return, isn't it? My parents' faces expressed such confusion that in another situation it might even have been funny. It was as if they couldn't connect the image of their non-technical daughter with the $200 million figure. Why didn't you ever tell us? Mom asked in a voice full of resentment. We thought that your company was small and insignificant? I finished for her. Yes, I know what you thought. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Jason looked like someone had just informed him that the earth was flat. His worldview, in which he was the brilliant technical genius, and I was the cute but inexperienced sister, was cracking at the seams. And then Grandma Eleanor asked the question that would forever change the dynamics of our family. Is that why your company just bought his company? The silence that followed that question was absolute. It was as if the world had stopped, frozen in that moment of truth. I looked at my grandmother in amazement and horror. How had she found out? We hadn't made any public announcements. Everything had been kept top secret until Monday. Jason was the first to break the silence. What's this nonsense? Digital Edge is worth, he stammered, apparently realizing for the first time that he might not know the real value of his company. Your little startup couldn't. Could, I replied quietly, deciding that the truth, however inconvenient, was better than continuing to lie. The announcement would come out on Monday. Nexus Solutions is acquiring Digital Edge and 4 other companies as part of our expansion strategy. The silence that followed Grandma Eleanor's question was absolute. Jason froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. His mother stopped with a glass of water to her lips, and his father's expression changed rapidly from confusion to disbelief to shock. It was as if time had stopped in our little family universe, where the immutable laws, Jason is a genius, Abby is cute but not particularly talented, suddenly ceased to apply. Have you ever watched someone's picture of the world crumble? How the reality a person has built up over the years cracks and crumbles like old plaster? In that moment, I saw it 3 times, in the eyes of my father, my mother, and my brother. Impossible. Jason was the first to come to his senses, his voice hoarse, like he was short of breath. Digital Edge is worth. You can't. Your little startup couldn't. Strangely, I felt neither triumph nor gloating at that moment. Just the strange calm of a man who no longer needs to pretend to be less than he is. Nexus Solutions recently completed a Series C round of financing, I said in a steady voice, as if I were reading the weather for tomorrow. The company was valued at more than $500 million. The acquisition of Digital Edge and 4 other companies is part of our expansion strategy. Mom dropped her fork, which hit the plate with a clinking sound. $500 million? She whispered, as if the number were in some obscure language. Abby, why didn't you ever tell us your company was so successful? There were several layers of emotion in her question: distrust, resentment, confusion, and, perhaps for the first time in a long time, a glimmer of genuine interest in my work. You never really asked, I said, and that simple truth hung in the air like an invisible accusation. Grandma Eleanor sat in her chair with a slight smile, watching the unfolding drama with the serenity of someone who finally sees justice. You're my boss now? Jason said, his voice so genuinely confused that in another situation it might have been funny. Technically, yes, I answered, trying to be subtle. But our organizational structure provides a great deal of autonomy for technical leaders. Dad coughed, clearly trying to collect his thoughts. I don't understand, Abby. How did this happen? You've always been. He stopped, apparently realizing he was about to say something like, not as smart as Jason. Not as technical? I prompted, and he nodded embarrassedly. That's exactly why the Nexus has succeeded. We build technology for people, not for other engineers. The rest of dinner passed in a strange, tense atmosphere. Jason barely spoke, absorbed in his own thoughts. My parents asked cautious questions about my company, as if it were the first time they'd heard of it. My grandmother occasionally winked at me across the table, clearly enjoying the situation. The weeks that followed were a period of profound transformation for our entire family. Relationships that had been built for years on defined roles and expectations now needed a complete overhaul. Mom called the day after Easter dinner, her voice sounding unusually quiet and uncertain. "Abby, your father and I are very proud of you," she said, after an awkward pause. "And we're sorry that we didn't see how meaningful what you were doing was." That apology, awkward and not fully articulated, was like a breath of fresh air to me after years of being trapped in a stuffy room. But it couldn't instantly heal years of neglect. "Thank you, Mom," I replied. It meant a lot to me. In the days that followed, I watched my parents oscillate between shame at their past treatment of me and pride at my unexpected success. They began reading articles about Nexus solutions, seeking out interviews with me in technical publications, and telling their friends about my accomplishments with the same enthusiasm they'd used to talk about Jason. But the most challenging and interesting changes were taking place in my relationship with my brother. Jason was going through the difficult process of accepting a new reality. His world, in which he was the brilliant technical genius, and I was the cute but incompetent little sister, collapsed overnight. A week after the acquisition was officially announced, he called me. The conversation was tense, filled with awkward pauses. "So, now what?" he finally asked. "Are you going to fire me?" "Why would I do that?" I was genuinely surprised. "You're a great technician, Jason. Your skills are valuable to the company. But I've always—" He stopped talking, and I could almost physically feel him struggling with his pride. "I haven't always been good with your ideas." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him. "Maybe we should both start fresh," I suggested. "You could come to the Nexus office next week, meet the team, see what we're working on." He agreed, though without much enthusiasm. The day Jason visited Nexus Solutions headquarters for the first time was a day I'll always remember. He entered the building with the expression of a man preparing for an unpleasant medical procedure, tense, wary, lips tightly pressed together. His eyes opened wide when he saw the scale of our operation. 3 floors of modern office space, hundreds of employees, glass meeting rooms where work was in full swing. "Impressive," he murmured as he followed me down the main hallway. I introduced him to Lauren and the other key members of the team. Lauren, knowing the history of our relationship, was professionally polite, but I saw a hint of amusement in her eyes as she shook hands with the man whose condescending comments about her sister's non-technical approach I'd been retelling for years. "We've heard good things about your work at Digital Edge," she said, which was true. Despite the company's problems as a whole, Jason's technical solutions were always innovative. I watched his attitude gradually change from defensive to curious. This became especially evident during a technical discussion with Lauren and our lead architects. They were discussing a distributed systems problem that Jason's team at Digital Edge had been struggling with for years. "We solved this problem using asynchronous queuing," one of our senior developers explained, drawing a diagram on the whiteboard. "But how do you deal with the data consistency problem?" Jason asked, genuinely interested for the first time that day. "Here." Lauren walked over to the board and began to flesh out the diagram. "We use a combination of optimistic locking and consistent identifiers." I watched as Jason leaned forward, fully immersed in the discussion. His questions became more and more involved. His eyes lit up with that special sparkle that comes when a technical expert is confronted with an elegant solution to a complex problem. At that moment, I realized an important truth. Despite years of rivalry and misunderstanding, Jason and I shared a passion for technology. We just approached it from different angles. he from the code and architecture side, and I from the user experience and business value side. And perhaps it was the combination of these approaches that could create something truly revolutionary. After the 3-hour technical immersion, Jason looked both exhausted and strangely energized. When we were alone in my office, he was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. "I never thought you'd," he began, then stopped and tried again. "I always thought your approach was too simple, too focused on superficial things. But what you've created here, it's impressive, Abby. Really impressive." Those words I'd been waiting years to hear almost brought tears to my eyes. But I held back. It wasn't the time for sentimentality. "The offer still stands," I said. "We'd like you to stay with the company after the acquisition. Your technical skills would be a valuable addition to our team." "As your subordinate," he said, and I noticed how difficult it was for him to say those words. "As a valuable team member, with a lot of autonomy," I corrected him. "I know this is going to be a difficult adjustment for both of us. But Jason, think about what we could create together by combining your technical prowess and our approach to user experience." He nodded thoughtfully, and in that moment, I saw a glimpse of a possible future. A future where we are not rivals, but partners. Where different approaches don't oppose each other, but complement each other. "I need to think," he said finally. "It's a lot to think about." "Sure," I agreed. "Take the time you need." As he walked away, I noticed that his shoulders weren't so tense anymore, and his gait was more confident. Something had changed in him during that day. The first step toward accepting a new reality, where his younger sister, whom he had always considered technically incompetent, was now effectively his boss. Realigning family roles is a painful and challenging process. When relationships have been built for years on a certain hierarchy, any change in it is resisted. But sometimes it is necessary, not for justice or ego gratification, but so that everyone can find their true place and realize their potential. As I drove home that evening, I thought of Grandma Eleanor and her words that have served as my guiding light for years. Different minds solve different problems. Maybe now my family was beginning to realize the depth of that simple truth. Change rarely happens overnight. More often than not, they come gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a sea tide that changes the landscape of the shore with the tiny movements of the waves. That's what happened with my relationship with Jason. 3 weeks after I acquired Digital Edge, he officially accepted the position of CTO of Nexus Solutions' Workflow Automation Division. His decision was a turning point for both of us. Not just a new line in the corporate structure, but a profound symbol of the changes taking place within him and between us. It was preceded by several long, sometimes painful conversations with Lauren about the technical roadmap and integration strategy. "I'm not going to work under someone who doesn't understand the technical side," he said during one meeting, without looking me in the eye. "No one is asking you to do that," Lauren said calmly. "You'll be working with me, and you'll have complete autonomy over technical decisions." He hesitated, weighing his options. I could see the inner struggle on his face. Pride versus pragmatism, old grudges versus new possibilities. "What do you think, Abby?" he asked suddenly, for the first time in a long time, really asking me for my opinion. "I think that together, we can create something really important," I replied, "but only if you really want to." Eventually, he agreed, and that moment was the foundation stone of our new relationship. The first executive session with Jason present was decidedly awkward. He sat tensely as I laid out the company's strategic priorities for the next quarter. His posture, crossed arms, compressed lips, all betrayed a man who felt out of place. But when the conversation turned to the technical aspects of integrating Digital Edge's systems with our platform, something changed. His eyes lit up, his shoulders squared, and he began to speak with the passion and depth of understanding that has always made him an outstanding engineer. "If we modify the caching approach and implement asynchronous event processing, we can achieve a 30% performance gain while simplifying the architecture, he explained, drawing diagrams on the board. I specifically noted his valuable contribution, emphasizing how his suggestions would improve not only the technical aspects, but also the user experience. Jason's proposed solution will allow us to make the interface more responsive and intuitive, which is completely in line with our philosophy. At that moment, something flashed in his eyes. Surprise, gratitude, recognition? Perhaps all of the above together. For the first time, someone appreciated his technical prowess, not in isolation, but as part of a broader, user-centered vision. Over the following months, we established a new professional dynamic. Jason's technical prowess, focused on common goals rather than used as a weapon of superiority, proved invaluable on several key projects. This new dynamic gradually began to affect our personal relationship as well. A real breakthrough occurred when a major client, an international logistics company, required a customized implementation of our platform with unique requirements. The project required both Jason's deep technical skills in distributed systems, architecture, and my understanding of user processes and business logic. Let's work on it together, I suggested, surprising both him and myself. We spent countless hours discussing, arguing, and compromising. Sometimes it wasn't easy. Years of rivalry don't disappear overnight. But each time we overcame another disagreement, something new emerged between us: mutual respect. After a successful launch, when a client raved about a solution that combined technical excellence with an intuitive interface, Jason said something I'll never forget. "We're a pretty good team when we're not competing." This simple phrase has come to define our new balance sheet: not competition, but collaboration. Not whose approach is better, but how our approaches complement each other. A year after the Easter dinner that turned our family's understanding of itself upside down, we gathered again at Grandma Eleanor's house for our annual tradition. But now almost everything is different. Nexus Solutions has nearly doubled in size and expanded internationally. The integration of digital edge technology has been even more valuable than originally envisioned, opening up new markets and opportunities. But the most important changes didn't happen in the business, but in ourselves. Family dynamics transformed. Jason and I developed a new relationship based on mutual respect rather than competition. Our parents stopped comparing us and began to value everyone's unique contributions. And Grandma Eleanor observed it all with the quiet wisdom of someone who always saw the full picture. "It's like looking at a whole different family," Grandma Eleanor whispered as she handed me the dinner rolls. "Though I always knew you had it in you." "How could you have known I would succeed?" I asked, still marveling at her faith in me when no one else shared it. Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining with that special wisdom that only comes with years of living and an open heart. "I've lived long enough to recognize different kinds of brilliance. Jason has always been what people expect a technical genius to be: all code and algorithms. But you, Abby, you understand the human side of technology. You see connections and possibilities that purely technical minds overlook. I always knew you'd find your own way, dear. You just needed everyone else to see it too."